When we restore the question, can art change the world, from its inversion, we become conscious of the seriousness of the question. We become aware of the state of the world that art has to change. The world is and has been a troubled place, intractable to change, it seems. A simple glance at history will sober up any lazy optimist. From the time of ancient Egypt, with the rise of the pharaohs, men have been obsessed by power and control. The Mughals under Genghis Khan is a story of Mughals under Genghis Khan ravaged wherever they passed through. The ancient empires conquered and enslaved. The rise of societies, of city-states, of kingdoms is the rise of ideologies. Ancient Greece was sustained by slavery, as was Rome. Christianity spread its ideology by force as much as by wiles. Islam converts with the sword, with jihads that are holy wars. Two great impulses run through civilization: the impulse for beauty and the impulse for power. The ancient Egyptians have passed away into dust, but their monuments remain. Their wars with the Hittites, the ideology of their daily lives is gone, but the beauty at the heart of their power remains. The temples of Dendera or Abu Simbel, with their monumental statues, which Rilke said set the human face on the scale of the stars, lives on as a reminder that Ezra Pound was right when he said, "What thou lovest well remains, the rest is dross." If I were going to paraphrase him, I would say, what we love best remains, the rest is bullshit. It is said that when Alexander the Great entered the Persian city he had conquered, for the first time he was struck by the beauty of what he saw. The Greeks had always called the Persians barbarians. The beauty that Alexander saw made it a lie. He was seduced by the invisible presence of art in their everyday life, raised to a level of luxury in the palaces, the hanging gardens. My contention here is that art is a living, invisible presence in the lives of people. It is not only what people we call artists do. It is the aspect of beauty, the objects and deeds in excess of function, things of beauty done purely for themselves. The art of humanity is millennia old. We have been making art without knowing it. Our grave steles, our funeral rites, the little objects of eternity, the little statues, the carved forms that surprise archaeologists. A recent exhibition of prehistoric European art at the British Museum stunned everyone and compelled historians to pull back in time the dates of European art. A casual visit to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, which houses artifacts from all over the world, compels wonder at the persistence of the artistic impulse in humanity, from the South Pacific to brightest Africa. There you would see spears made into works of art with decorations in excess of function. You would see masks and figurines, statues of gods and squat Buddhas. You will see skulls decorated in a manner to convey fear to enemies. You will see canoes, boomerangs, rat traps, embroidered clothes, body armor, shields, patterned cloths, and 100 small and large ways in which the human impulse runs parallel to the history of man. My point is that it seems art is intrinsic to humanity. It is a fundamental impulse. When food, shelter, and procreative needs have been fulfilled, it seems humanity needs to create art as a way of being, a way of surviving, a way of knowing itself, a way of affirming its reality. Some people will think that I'm taking liberties with the idea of what art is. They might say I can't call an ancient African sculpting or a Polynesian figurine art in the same breath that I'd call Michelangelo's David art. I say that we have been progressively changing our idea of what art is. When the British colonialists in Benin in Nigeria in 1846 or thereabouts, after the Benin massacre, went into people's houses and brought out their gods and had heaps made of them that they burnt, they did not think those wooden figures were art. They were seen as objects of the devil's worship, objects of evil. And that was no different from the Nazis burning artworks of modernists in the 40s. When the artists of Europe were going through one of those phases of the rapid consumption of experimental ideas, exhausting itself in novelty, it was the discovery of Polynesian artifacts and the artifacts of Oceania and the wooden figures of the Africans that renewed the Western artistic impulse. A visit to the Trocadero in Paris one day by Matisse and another day later on by Picasso turned African primitive artifacts into pulsing works of art. The works didn't change. They were still the same silent wooden figures that had been carved in ritual form in Africa. But when they provided inspiration to the leading artists of the West, their stature changed. Partly because of this, the West now sees art where it saw artifacts. But to us in Africa, in Oceania or wherever, those works were always something more than art. They were invested with ritual force. They were objects of power. They were spirit-animated forms. They were forms into which had been seduced the super-terrestrial energies. It was this something more than art in the objects that gave them that untamable imaginative force that so fascinated Matisse and Picasso. They were not works made for museums. They were made to affect the universe. Let's not forget that. They were made to converse with spirits, to ward off evil, and to compel nature to some favor or other, or to seduce fertility into the land, and so on and so forth. In short, they were magic objects. You notice I'm kind of skipping here because I want to. When we transform our idea of what art is, it becomes clear that civilization is impossible without art. One could even say that a society is almost impossible without art. I saw an exhibition of African combs in Cambridge last year, and I was amazed that even in comb making, the human genius can blaze. There were combs that went back 4,000 or 5,000 years, and each one was made in beauty, in excess of function. While here, I should also mention the hairstyles of African women. From the pyramidal hair weaving to hairstyles so complex, they're like the Gordon's knot that nearly defeated Alexander. I could speak of drum syncopations, the rapid foot interlaced dancing, the cloth dyeing, the made wooden figures that people throw on rooftops when someone dies in Yoruba land. I could mention the Anglo-Saxon rings, their figurines, their jewelry. I have avoided speaking about the considered masterpieces of art because they're already swamped in discourse and are the source of the confusion about the power and limits of art. When you hear the question, can art save the world, I bet some of you are thinking of sanctified art. Probably your mind goes to Leonardo, Michelangelo, Picasso, Beethoven, Mozart, Pushkin, Shoenko, Kigbo, Achebe, Kuhn, Eli, the great artists and the celebrated moderns. You are thinking, no doubt, of canonical art as well as the champion art, the art of installations, the art of gestures, of light, of happenings. And you are thinking, no doubt, how on earth can Goya save the world? I once had a fantastic discussion with a friend after much drinking on what might happen to the world if the Mona Lisa did not exist. It was based on an essay I read. We began by subtracting all the sense of beauty that would not have been with us. Then we subtracted the other works that might not have been made. And then we subtracted the sense of wonder that might not have been awoken. And then we managed by a series of subtractions fueled by more wine and good food to arrive at a modern world in which life would be poorer and we would all be sadder. Some magic sense of our possibilities would be duller, and much that was achieved over the centuries would simply not exist at all. It was a way of saying that we are what we are because of what has been created, whether we're aware of it or not. By extension, think of what the world would be like if the art impulse had been dominant or dead in humanity. Subtract the vast and almost infinite contribution made to our lives. We would have to subtract all the buildings, our clothes, the evolution of our food, almost everything we take for granted. then would have to subtract our sensibilities. For art, its presence, has evolved our sensibilities too, our capacity for beauty. Anything in us which reaches for and longs for something we do not know has already been amplified by art. For art is the visible emblem of that unknown yearning. Maybe the most mysterious thing about art is the way it amplifies our humanity, the way it wakes up corners and edges and margins of our humanity, the way it makes us more richly human in a way that we wouldn't have conceived of before. The truth is that our humanity is like a vast castle that we barely inhabit. We live in only a few rooms in the castle of our humanity. They are the rooms given prominence by education, the moral temper of our times, and the secret stories at work in our psyches. But art resonates these other rooms, these halls and cellars, these unknown spaces, and we shiver before the unknown splendor of our inner architecture. We become more ourselves. We thought we were a hut when indeed we were a castle. Art enlarges our sense of ourselves in this castle. It reveals our secret magnificence. And it does it without trying. Maybe this is why artists have such trouble explaining to the world the value of what they do. They can't know the value of what they do. They have to be partially ignorant of their boundless effects. They cannot know because they cannot know the destiny of what they've done. An African artist thought he was shaping a piece of wood to ward off evil, but in the process he was helping to inspire and transform the art of the West. There's no way he or she could have known that. Mozart's composing an overture on a billiard table in his house and would much later bring tears to the eyes of my mother hearing his music for the first time. He could not have known that he would touch the heart of a faraway African princess. In a sense, art has no destiny, for its destiny is never ending. It is as perpetual as the future of humanity. When organizations ask art to reveal its function, to show what it does, art is silent. It appears useless. And Oscar Wilde was right in his partial and paradoxical way when he said all art is useless. If we look for use in art the way we look for use in a gun, then it will always be useless. In a world of Ebola, terrorism, suicide bombers, Boko Haram, art appears powerless. In a world of concentration camps, gross continental injustices, environmental disasters, a world where vast slums are engulfing India and Africa, art seems irrelevant. The greatest art in the world cannot heal a child dying of dysentery. The greatest novel in the world cannot feed a child dying in a famine. All the suffering in the world, suffering that can be avoided, which are caused by the failure of vision in governments, make the condition of art pointless and ineffective. The Jungle, a novel by Upton Sinclair, caused such a fuss that the laws in the meat industry were changed in America, but class division and social injustice remained. All the committed novels in the world have not eradicated racism, sexism, class division, or helped narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. The Spanish Civil War went on raging and paid no attention to Picasso's Guernica. Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice did not stop the spread of anti-Semitism. Richard Wright's Native Son, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, and Toni Morrison's Beloved have not succeeded in overcoming the racial bias in American society. Felu Anikulapo Kuti's caustic lyrics and infectious music has not had any effect on the corruption at the heart of Nigeria. Soyinka's opera Wonyosi, Chinua Achebe's A Man of the People, have not made the political class in Nigeria more aware and responsible. Ngugi's Petals of Blood has left Kenyan society, its politics, its class division unchanged. Mozart never stopped a suicide bomber. Nazi officers in charge of the gassing of Jews and overseeing the conversion of their fat into soap, after washing their hands, went home to listen to their beloved Beethoven. Wagner was conscripted into the dreams of the Third Reich. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the anthem of the European Union, was also one of the anthems of the Nuremberg rallies. Ballet continued to be danced, novels were written, music was composed, while the Gulag devoured millions in Soviet Russia. Against the brutal facts of the world, the march of armies, the world wars, the stealth bombers, the rise of ISIS, the state-sponsored terrorism, the eternal conundrum of Palestine and Israel, the long-forgotten history of American destabilization of other countries for their own interests, the big swarming spread of Chinese influence, the economic strangulation of the poorer countries by the richer ones. Against these facts, art seems totally powerless. We ask the wrong questions, the wrong things of art when we put it in the equation of the forces of this world. As Auden famously said, a poem never stopped a bullet. We therefore make a big mistake when we demand that our art be effective and that it give proof of its value among the mad forces that holds the world in a grip of iron and fire. Voltaire wrote poems to Frederick the Great, wondering what role poetry had in wars. He got another poem back from Frederick, while the war that he was fighting just simply carried on. Goya's series of etches, The Disasters of War, has never been consulted by governments planning war. Just before the American announcement of its invasion of Iraq, General Colin Powell had Picasso's Guernica on the wall behind him covered up. To ask art to prove its worth in a world of Auschwitz is folly. In Europe right now, extreme right-wing movements are on the rise. Since 9/11, the temperature of the world has edged towards intolerance and beyond. We are all being silently conscripted into a new polarization. On one hand, Islamic fundamentalists wreak havoc in Paris, London, Germany, and Belgium. They are tearing apart the edges of 4 nations in West Africa. It is as if the counter-crusades is upon us, abolishing 400 years between them. Islamophobia has taken root among intelligent men and women in the West. In Europe right now, immigration issue rages the specter of Nazi Germany. The holding centers for illegal immigrants swell. The prisons of England and America are bursting with a disproportionate presence of black male prisoners. Every day, Africans crowd into the suicidal boats to come to the West, and many drown in the seas. In England, the rise of UKIP. In Germany, the rise in protests against immigrants. In France, the Charlie Hebdo-inspired marches reveal tectonic shifts whose destiny no one knows. The wave of relative tolerance that existed in the West between the 80s and the 90s, a sort of racial spring, is practically over. Something has shifted in the heart of Europe. The ascendancy of Obama as President of America has only inflamed and made more rabid the racial temperature of America. A subtle shift in racial muffling has crept over Britain. With lynchings and naked discrimination, one could speak out. But with this new subtle form of muffling and control that leads to apathy among black male youths, how do you draw attention to this? How can art have force and truth in such murky conditions in the world? The Satanic Verses was written by a man of the left, a man of humor, a man humane, and it is now being used in the anti-Islamic crusade. The novel began as one thing and has now been conscripted by forces that may end up inflicting untold damage on innocent Muslims. This must have been very far from the intentions of the writer. The destiny of art is a mystery. The facts of the world are too crude for the subtlety of art. Forgive me for a minute. I just want us to take stock. My friend, when she was typing this section, she took a deep breath and had a glass of whiskey. I wish I had some whiskey. Actually, does anybody have a drink with them there? I always have who's got a drink? I always have a friend who carries around a little flask of gin. All right, you're a very pure audience. So let's take stock of the world for 1 minute. Let's look at where we are. Wars in the Middle East, war in Ukraine. Greece, I'm just going to mention the words. Greece, ice caps melting. Water wars brewing. Overpopulation. Overfishing. Ozone layer. Africa. Boko Haram. Corruption. Every day somewhere in Europe, a terrorist act is attempted. Russia, China, America. This is not going to be an extensive survey, but this is where we are right now. We live in a decentered, denatured, increasingly atheistic world. Here's a paradox. Scale of suffering turning people off God. Scale of suffering turning people towards God. Atheism grows in the West, believers grow in Africa, in India, South America. Those who have can afford not to believe in God. Those who have not cannot afford to not believe in God. Success and luxury usurp the place of God. Hunger and insufficiency makes keen the sense of the spiritual. It's not as simple as that, of course, but it's worth wondering at. Those who have lose belief. Those who have not have to have belief. It's very interesting. This is where we are. We live in fear. We live in hope. We live in wonder. We read the world through fear. We live between news stories and no belief. Our world is post-existential and post-apocalyptic. We're already dreaming of deserting it and starting colonies on distant planets. Even in this very incomplete survey of the world, it becomes clear that the troubles in the world are way too complex and complicated for us. They're bigger than us. Seen in this way, they kind of overwhelm us. It becomes clear that no one thing can save the world. Political parties can't do it. They can't save the world because of their inherently divisive nature. Ideology is not going to do it because it carries its inherent limitations. Science ain't going to save the world because its discoveries have incalculable uses for good and evil. The atom had hardly been split and its awesome forces harnessed for bombs that could wipe out half the human race. It had hardly split the atom when it started using it for evil. Science has made a great contribution to our lives. We know that. But it has also made a contribution that can terminate our lives. It gives with one hand and takes with the other. Also, if you really think about it, technology has also helped to make us a little bit lazy, physically and spiritually. And it also has another shadow side that I want to draw attention to, which is seen in the way in which Africa has been made into dumping grounds for technological waste. Economics is not going to save the world because the world is not tractable. At best, all of these things are tools that can be wielded in the service of a great and beneficial vision. But where are we going to turn to for this vision? Philosophy ought to help, and once philosophers were sages, and the dream of a philosopher king once was a great temptation to estates. But philosophy has lost its way, has wandered down byways of increasing insularity and hair-splitting solipsisms. Religion used to be the guide of nations, and religion at its most humane has helped and inspired us with the flower of civilization. One thinks of the golden age of Islam in the 12th and 13th centuries, of Islam as the keeper of the flame of light when the West slipped into the dark ages. One thinks of the beneficial impulse of Buddhism. One thinks of Christianity and its ideal of mercy, kindness, charity, and its invention of courtly love. There is no doubt that religion at its best has not enriched humanity. But it has also been the ruination of us. Religion has been divisive, has arrogated itself the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of heaven. It has waged wars, sanctioned slave trades, and colluded with the worst injustices of our time, the concentration camps. It has helped demonize the Jew and impose its ideologies on the world when people had ideas and cultures of their own. I'd like to make a difference here between the religious and the spiritual. The religious is the institutionalized fossil of the spiritual. At its origin, religions were spiritual. Jesus was spiritual, holy. And many people believe that his message was distorted by the church. The spiritual impulse has been the saving of man. But now, that spiritual impulse is in exile. Religions believe art as a vehicle of their creed. Christian art gave us saints, Madonnas, and endless crucifixions. Islamic art gave us intimate patterns, but no representations of Allah or the Buddha. Buddhism gave us stupas and interminable Buddhas. State art is no better. Nations want art that somehow glorify them. Most national museums are crowded with paintings of interest only to that nation. Its novels and poems read only by itself. We always ask art to do a specific thing. We always ask it to represent our range of interests, that it serves our class, our tribe, or our group. And in this, art is always a rebel. It may serve one thing, but it always ends up serving the whole. The cruder art becomes, the more it loses its mystery and spiritual force. But, get this, only a crude art, it would appear, can tackle the crude facts of the world. Someone was saying to me the other day that if nations conducted their wars through art, that the world would be a better place. If instead of bombs and missiles we warred with novels and poems, with paintings, sculptures, and films, maybe the aggressive tendency of human beings would have a higher expression. But art is the only human activity that engages and expresses the creative impulse in us. In the Kabbalah, in the thought of Isaac Luria, there's a really weird notion of something called the Timzum. Has anybody ever heard of this weird notion of the Timzum? I'm not going to go into it because that would be another 7 hours. But there's this really weird notion of the Timzum and the Sephirotic vessels of the Godhead that got broken. And they believed that the broken world needed us to complete it and to rectify it. There's another legend of the lost word, that when the lost word is found, harmony will be restored to this broken world. These legends are just a hint that more than ordinary effort of man is needed to bring harmony to the human race. First we imitate, then we analyze, then we understand, then we master. Art at its deepest has always been about mastership. Why do I keep returning to the earliest art in this conversation? And that is because it reminds us of the creative matrix of man, and that art is about the capacity to solve problems, to imagine alternatives. Art redreams the world. It sees that there needs not to be only one reality. We tend to think that the way the world is the only way the world can be. All our pasts, we believe, has led to our presents. And then we slip into believing the inevitability of the world as it is. The capacity to reimagine reality is absolutely essential to our survival. But we cannot reimagine our reality till we first see that reality clearly and truthfully. Maybe also we cannot see it truthfully till we have a clear understanding of the sources and causes, the roots, if you like, of our reality. But I sometimes think that that understanding is a kind of luxury, and that the problem is so complicated that we'll spend millennia trying to disentangle it. But the Buddha tells a really wonderful story. The Buddha tells a story of a prince who'd gone out hunting. And someone shot an arrow that pierced him. His followers ran to him. And the prince wanted to know who shot the arrow, the name of the village, what kind of iron the arrow was made of, the artisans who made this arrow. He wanted to know who they were. He wanted to know the arrow practices. And the Buddha said, actually, all he needed to do was just pull the arrow out. There's another great story of Alexander the Great. You all know the story. He came to a town called Gordon, and where there was a hyper-entangled knot, which nobody could untie. People had been trying to untie it for years, and nobody had succeeded. The story goes that Alexander took out his sword and slashed right through it. Philosophers and historians have argued as to whether he actually really did untie the knot, technically. But the act of genius, of creative genius in this case, if you like, was in making the problem redundant. He cuts through it, the knot doesn't exist. You can argue about whether he untied it or not, but the knot doesn't exist anymore. Problem is gone. In the symbolism of the tarot, the sword represents clarity. To cut the knot with a sword means to solve a problem with supernatural clarity. Not the sword of violence, not the sword of killing and beheading, but the sword of truth, the sword of seeing clearly. It is interesting that in both stories, what is required is not a detailed knowledge of the arrow and the arrow makers, not a profound knowledge of the knot and who tied it, or who had tried to untie it. What was required was a great sense, a great act of presence, of being present, and an existential grasp of our ultimate goals. In one story, it was just simply plucking out the arrow, which for the Buddha, by the way, meant the transcending of the ultimate illusion. And in the other story, it meant a decisive act and a transcendent seeing. Both are stories. We have no evidence that these stories ever existed. They're acts of art squeezed from the unreality of history. You know, I think art exists in the tension between two impossibilities. I think art is a parallel of the creation myth. It is the image of our freedom. When people wander through an exhibition or listen to a piece of music or listen to a story being told, they are taking part in the original act of creation. Politics tells us that through the law and through the exertion of people, things can be made to happen. The acts of politics are filtered through wrangling and opposition, but rarely is anything pure achieved in that way. But art tells us we can conceive and create an alternative world. It tells us that we're as good as our dreams. This is a fact we have profoundly forgotten. Do you know? I think it was Borges who suggested that whenever we listen to a piece of music, we become the music. If I was going to extend him, I would say when we listen to Miles Davis, we become Miles Davis. You know, one funny thing that art does is that it passes on power. Another thing that it does is it reminds us that our world is our garden, our canvas, our score, our novel. The world is our stage. We scripted it. Can art save the world? The world can only be saved by us. No one, nothing else can do it. I'm going to go into a riff now. Emerson said somewhere that the world is emblematic. That's a lovely phrase, isn't it? The world is emblematic. The world is a living symbol of us, of our consciousness. It is what we've made it, or what we've failed to make it. And the world is not going to change itself. Where does art have its greatest effect? Can anybody remember when I said earlier where art has its greatest effect? Say that again. That's cool. It's our consciousness. The world is emblematic. Show me what the people do, and I will tell you what their secret myths are. Microcosmic level, macrocosmic level. You believe that the force of politics and laws can shape our society. But you make laws that are against our secret impulses, and those laws will not be obeyed. I could give you many examples of the way in which our stories, our secret stories, subverts our laws and our civilization. I think that civilization should not be measured by achievements. I think it should be measured by just one random individual. I'm now going into poetry. You know, maybe art is the only thing that expresses the whole of what we are. It reminds us that reality is unreal. When the people want to conceal, when the people want to perpetuate what they've learned through the ages, where do they hide them? They hide them in art. They hide them in myths. Can art save the world? Only to the degree that it helps to unify us. Only to the degree that it awakens what is greatest in us. Only to the degree that it helps to heal the rift in our world. That it takes us beyond ourselves. I know some people think that the true value of art is for creating revolution, but the only true revolution that would last is our inner revolution. Only free people can build a free world. If there's one great benefit to the enemy of our times, it is that it forces us to take responsibility. We are stuck with this mess. You know, in a sense, the world in which we find ourselves is the ultimate work of art. The ultimate work of our art. So we're all co-artists of this world, creating it to the edge of extinction or transcendence. You know, the greatest artists teach us some invaluable lessons. They teach us that the world is malleable, that it can be changed by the force of our spirit. Great artists are great not only in what they create, they are great because they show us how great we can be in one way or another. They are great because they show us that we too have the power and the sleeping wisdom to alter our world into something beautiful and just. They are great because they awaken the artist in us, the artist of life. In that sense, they make us better, freer, and more fearless. I'm coming to the end, folks. I've kind of lost weight just doing this. Everything we do is an act of creation. Maybe that is the lost message of the holy books and the Vedas, the Talmud, the Orishas. That the world was created by God or by whatever science calls it. But after the world was created by whatever science calls it, the world is created by us. We are the micro-gods of our world, but we have forgotten it. Or we've been duped out of knowing it. And now we have come to believe that the world is what it is. It's a phrase that V.S. Naipaul begins one of his novels about Africa. The world is what it is. We have now come to believe that the world is what it is. But let's be honest with one another. It is what it is because that's how we have made it, or failed to make it. Everything we do is an act of creation. Even when we destroy, we create. When we do nothing, we create by allowing that which others are creating to affect us. We may as well choose what we want to create in this world. And our choices depend on the quality of our consciousness. We have to choose wisely because all our choices have endless consequences. The unavoidability of consequences is another thing that art teaches us. Cézanne said that when he puts a spot of red in one corner of a painting, he has to change the whole painting because of that tiny dot of red. Our tiniest choices can have huge effects. Our smallest silence can allow in great evils. Another thing that art teaches us is that vision is the thing. Sometimes a painting evolves without vision by the genius of accident or choice. But at some point, the artist must see what is emerging and must grasp the possibility of what is becoming. They must have or discover a vision of what the work can be. You either start with a vision or you discover one along the way. But vision is indispensable. We all know that biblical prophet and what he said about lack of vision making his people perish. It is always so, it will always be so. No vision, no future. Psychiatrists say that in the war between will and imagination, that imagination always wins. Imagination is the dream, and will is what helps us get there. But sometimes, you see, imagination has a will of its own. If we see something clearly enough in our imagination, the strength of it will give us the will and the motivation to get there. The world cannot be saved if we cannot imagine that it can be saved. Without imagination, this world will surely perish. This could go on indefinitely. This talk. But I'm going to end it by saying that we are the artists of our world. We are the co-makers of its realities. We are creating all the time. Can art save the world? Only when we realize that the world is our dream and our nightmare, and we are the artists of it. The world can only be saved if each one of us becomes more aware artists. We have to awaken from the sleep of our powerlessness. Our ancient ancestors who made their first tools from stone, who made something out of nothing, were right. Art is a magical operation. It operates on the world and on ourselves. But our intentions must be noble. We have to be way better artists than we're capable of being. Artists of our world. Thank you very much.